The Winchester's barrel pressed cold against Martha Kellaway's shoulder as 8 bleeding Apache warriors collapsed against her cabin door. Blood pooled in the morning dust, seeping between the weathered planks of her porch. Their ragged breathing mixed with the distant thunder of hoofbeats. The posse from Copper Ridge, maybe 10 minutes behind and closing fast. "Please," gasped the youngest warrior, his dark eyes meeting hers through a mask of pain and dirt. A bullet had torn through his shoulder, the wound still weeping crimson. "Help us." Martha's finger trembled on the trigger. 3 years of whispered accusations echoed in her mind. Cursed widow, deathbringer, the woman whose touch meant doom for any man fool enough to love her. The townspeople had made their feelings clear. She was barely tolerated, a necessary evil who doctored their wounds and birthed their babies because no one else would venture to the remote settlements. But this would be the final straw. "You don't understand what you're asking," she whispered, even as her trained eye cataloged their injuries. Gunshot wounds, knife cuts, a man with an arrow still protruding from his thigh. They were dying, all of them, without immediate help. The lead warrior, an older man with silver streaking his black hair, spoke in halting English. "Your people. They come to kill us. We have nowhere else." Behind him, one of the younger men collapsed entirely, his breathing shallow and irregular. Martha had seen that particular shade of gray creeping across a man's face too many times. He wouldn't last another hour without intervention. The hoofbeats grew louder. She could hear Sheriff Dalton's voice now, raised in angry command, spurring his men forward. They'd string her up alongside these warriors if they found them here. The whole territory was on edge after the latest raids, after the McKinnon family had been found butchered just 2 days ago. These Apache, wounded or not, represented everything the settlers feared. "Ma'am," the silver-haired warrior continued, his voice growing weaker, "we are not the ones who killed your people. Different band. We try to stop them, but..." He gestured helplessly at his wounded men. Martha's hands shook as she lowered the rifle slightly. In the distance, she could make out individual riders now, dust clouds marking their approach like storm fronts across the desert. Sheriff Dalton rode in front, his face set in the grim determination she'd seen too many times when frontier justice was about to be dispensed from the end of a rope. The youngest warrior's eyes fluttered closed. Blood had soaked through the crude bandage wrapped around his chest, and his breathing was becoming more labored with each passing moment. 3 of the others weren't much better off. Without help, they'd all be dead within the hour anyway, which might solve her problem if she could stomach watching men die on her doorstep while she did nothing. But Martha Kellaway had never been able to stomach that. Not even when it would have been easier. Not even when it would have been safer. The sound of approaching horses filled the air now, close enough that she could hear the jangle of spurs and the creak of leather. Sheriff Dalton's voice carried on the morning wind. "Tracks lead straight to the widow's place. If they're there, we end this today. But let's go back to how it all started, 3 months earlier, when Martha first arrived in Copper Ridge with nothing but a battered medical bag and a reputation that preceded her like smoke from a wildfire. The stagecoach wheels had barely stopped turning when Martha first heard the whispers. She'd stepped down onto the dusty main street of Copper Ridge with her worn leather medical bag and a single battered trunk. And already the townspeople were crossing themselves and backing away. "That's her," hissed Mrs. Abernathy to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "Martha Kellaway. 3 husbands, all dead before their time. They say she's got the devil's own touch." Martha kept her chin up and her eyes forward, though the familiar ache settled in her chest like a stone. Thomas dead from Apache arrows while riding fence. Samuel kicked by a spooked horse and never waking up. And poor Daniel, fever taken in the middle of winter when the medicine ran out. 3 good men, 3 different ways to die, but all somehow her fault in the eyes of those who needed someone to blame for the cruel randomness of frontier life. She'd come to Copper Ridge because it was remote, because it needed a doctor, and because she'd hoped distance might finally silence the accusations that followed her like shadows. The town had been desperate enough to accept her services, even with her reputation. But acceptance and welcome were 2 entirely different things. Dr. Henley, the aging physician she'd come to assist, met her at the door of his cramped office with tired eyes and hands that shook from too much whiskey. "Ignore the talk," he said gruffly, though she noticed he kept the desk between them. "They need you here, curse or no curse. Lost 2 babies last month to fever, and I can barely hold a scalpel steady anymore." Martha had set up in the small room behind the doctor's office, but it quickly became clear that most patients preferred to wait for Henley's unsteady hands rather than risk her cursed touch. So she'd taken to riding out to the isolated homesteads and mining camps, the places where people were desperate enough to overlook superstition in favor of survival. That's how she'd ended up in the cabin 15 miles northeast of town, a sturdy log structure built by a prospector who'd given up on finding silver and headed back east. It suited her perfectly, remote enough that she wouldn't have to endure the daily whispers and crossed fingers, but close enough to reach when someone needed emergency care. The cabin came with 20 acres of scrubland, a good well, and a barn that she'd converted into a makeshift surgery for the worst cases. She delivered 3 babies there in her first month, saved a miner's arm from gangrene, and successfully removed a bullet from a cowboy's shoulder. Word spread, as it always did in small communities. But the remoteness of her location meant that only the most desperate made the journey. She preferred it that way. Out here, she could focus on the work without constantly feeling the weight of suspicious stares. The land was harsh, but honest. Unlike the people in town, it didn't judge her for the men she'd loved and lost. The first hint of trouble had come 6 weeks after her arrival, when Jake Morrison rode up to her cabin with a bullet wound in his leg and news that made her blood run cold. "Apache been hitting the outer settlements," he'd gasped as she cleaned the wound. "Not the peaceful ones from the reservation. War party, maybe 30 strong. They hit the Jennings place yesterday, burned it to the ground." Martha's hands had stilled for just a moment as memories flooded back. Thomas had died in an Apache raid, though she'd never blamed the Apache themselves for defending their land. The frontier was soaked in blood from both sides, each act of violence spawning another in an endless cycle that consumed good people like kindling. "Anyone else hurt?" she'd asked, continuing to work. "Jim Jennings took an arrow to the shoulder, but his family got away. Word is the raiders are moving north toward your area." Jake had studied her face carefully. "Might want to think about staying in town for a while, ma'am. This cabin's awful isolated." But Martha had chosen isolation for a reason. She'd thanked Jake for the warning, sent him on his way with his wound properly dressed, and continued her work. If trouble came, she'd face it as she'd faced everything else, with her medical bag, her rifle, and the stubborn determination that had carried her through 3 funerals and countless nights of loneliness. She hadn't expected the trouble to come in the form of wounded warriors seeking help rather than dealing death. She certainly hadn't expected to face the choice between her own safety and her oath to heal, with the lives of 8 men hanging in the balance and a posse thundering toward her door. But then, Martha Kellaway had learned long ago that the frontier rarely offered the choices you expected, only the ones that revealed who you truly were when everything else was stripped away. The first accusation came on a Tuesday morning when Martha rode into town for supplies. She'd barely dismounted from her mare when Reverend Pike approached with his usual stern expression, magnified by something darker. "Mrs. Kellaway," he said, his voice carrying across the dusty street, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Curious thing happened last night. Apache hit the Weber Ranch, just 5 miles south of your place. You hear anything unusual?" Martha kept her face neutral as she tied her horse to the hitching post. "I heard gunshots in the distance, Reverend. Figured it was hunters or someone dealing with a predator." "Predators, indeed," Pike replied, his eyes cold. 6 head of cattle stolen, barn burned, and young Tommy Weber barely escaped with his life. Strange how these raids keep happening so close to where you've settled." The implication hung in the air, like smoke from a green fire. Around them, townspeople had stopped their morning business to listen, their faces reflecting the same mixture of suspicion and fear that Martha had grown accustomed to seeing. But this was different. This wasn't just about her being a cursed widow anymore. This was about something far more dangerous. "You're suggesting what exactly, Reverend?" Martha asked quietly, though she already knew where this was heading. "I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am. Just noting patterns. 3 raids in the past month, all within 10 miles of your cabin. Makes a man wonder if there's some communication happening." Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward from the small crowd that had gathered. "My herald says he saw smoke signals one evening last week, coming from the direction of your place. Says he counted at least 4 separate columns." Martha's jaw tightened. "Your herald was likely seeing smoke from my chimney and the heat distortion from the rocks. I was boiling instruments and preparing medicines that evening." "At sunset?" Sheriff Dalton's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him approaching with that measured gait that meant official business. "Seems an odd time for medical preparations." "I work when the work needs doing, Sheriff. Same as anyone else trying to make a living out here." Dalton nodded slowly, but his hand rested on the butt of his pistol. "Course you do, ma'am. Nobody's questioning your dedication. But folks are worried. These Apache, they're not hitting randomly. They know which homesteads are soft targets, which families are away from home. That kind of information has to come from somewhere." The crowd murmured agreement, and Martha felt the familiar chill of being the outsider, the different one, the woman whose very presence seemed to invite trouble. But this was worse than before. Before, they'd blamed her for bringing death to her husbands through some supernatural curse. Now they were suggesting she was actively collaborating with their enemies. "I've lost a husband to Apache raiders, Sheriff," Martha said, her voice carrying more steel than she'd intended. "I hardly think I'd be working with them." "Desperate people do desperate things," Pike interjected. "Maybe they promised to leave you alone if you helped them. Maybe you figured it was better to side with the devil you know than the devil you don't." Martha's hand moved instinctively toward the Navy Colt at her hip, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the crowd. The tension ratcheted up another notch, and she forced herself to relax. "I came to town for supplies," she said evenly. "If you're going to arrest me, Sheriff, then do it. Otherwise, I have sick people depending on me." Dalton studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "No arrest today, ma'am. But I'll be keeping a closer eye on that area. For everyone's safety." As Martha gathered her supplies, she could hear the whispered conversations continuing around her. The word traitor floated on the air more than once, and she saw more than one person touch their gun belt when she passed. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she knew that the next Apache raid, whenever it came, would likely be blamed on her regardless of the facts. That evening, as she rode back to her cabin, Martha couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Twice she stopped and scanned the ridgelines, but saw nothing more threatening than a hawk circling high overhead. Still, the sensation persisted, and she found herself checking the loads in her rifle more carefully than usual. She was 3 miles from home when she saw the smoke rising from the direction of the Henderson place. Black smoke, thick and oily, the kind that came from burning buildings rather than cooking fires. By the time she reached the ridge overlooking their homestead, the raiders were already gone, leaving behind the familiar aftermath of frontier violence. Scattered livestock, smoldering ruins, and the kind of silence that spoke of lives suddenly ended. Martha sat her horse on that ridge for a long time, staring down at the destruction and knowing with absolute certainty that tomorrow the townspeople would be asking why the cursed widow's cabin had been spared while good Christian families burned. The attack came at midnight on the 3rd night after Martha found the Henderson place in ashes. She'd been expecting trouble, but not the kind that would stumble bleeding onto her doorstep seeking salvation instead of delivering death. The first gunshots echoed across the desert like thunder, distant but intense enough to wake her from uneasy sleep. Martha rolled from her narrow bed and reached for the Winchester, her bare feet finding the cold wooden floor as more shots erupted from somewhere to the south. Not random hunting or a rancher dealing with predators, this was sustained combat, the kind of rapid-fire exchange that meant men were fighting for their lives. She pulled on her boots and coat, checking the rifle's load by feel in the darkness. Through her single window, she could see orange flickers against the night sky, muzzle flashes painting brief portraits of violence across the landscape. The firing was moving, getting closer, and with it came the sound she'd learned to recognize during her years on the frontier, the thunder of hoofbeats in retreat. Martha cracked open her door and listened. The shooting had stopped, but the hoofbeats continued, accompanied now by voices, angry shouts in English, growing louder as they approached her position. She recognized Sheriff Dalton's voice among them, raised in command. "They're headed for the widow's place. Cut them off at the creek crossing." Her blood went cold. Whatever had happened, whoever was running, the posse clearly believed the fugitives were making for her cabin. In their minds, that probably confirmed every suspicion they'd been harboring about her supposed collaboration with the Apache. The hoofbeats split, some riders continuing north while others veered east toward the creek. Martha could hear Dalton shouting orders, organizing a pursuit that would drive the fleeing riders directly toward her homestead. Whether by design or accident, she was about to be caught in the middle of whatever violence had erupted in the desert. She was still debating whether to douse her lamp and hide when different hoofbeats approached from the south. Slower, more labored, with an irregular rhythm that spoke of injured horses or riders. Through her window, she saw them emerging from the darkness. 8 Apache warriors, their ponies stumbling with exhaustion, several of the riders swaying in their saddles. The lead rider raised his hand when he spotted her cabin, and the group came to a halt 50 yards from her door. Even in the moonlight, Martha could see the dark stains on their clothing, the way some of them clutched at wounds, the desperate exhaustion written in their posture. The older warrior with silver-streaked hair called out to her in halting English, "Doctor woman, we know you help hurt people. Please." Martha's finger found the trigger of her rifle, but she didn't raise it. These weren't raiders fresh from burning homesteads. These were wounded men seeking aid. The younger warrior beside their leader was barely conscious, blood seeping through a crude bandage wrapped around his chest. Another had an arrow protruding from his thigh, the shaft broken off short, but the point still buried deep. "What happened?" she called back, staying in her doorway with the rifle ready. "Ambush," the leader replied. "White men, they wait for us at Waterhole. We come in peace, but they shoot first. Many of our brothers dead. We are all that escaped." Behind him, one of the wounded men slumped forward and would have fallen if his companion hadn't caught him. Martha could see the telltale pallor of blood loss, the shallow breathing that meant shock was setting in. These men were dying, and they'd come to her because word had spread, even among the Apache, that the widow woman at the isolated cabin would treat anyone who needed healing. But helping them now would be signing her own death warrant. The posse was already convinced she was collaborating with raiders. Finding wounded Apache warriors at her cabin would be all the proof they needed to string her up alongside them. "There are men coming," she said. "Armed men who want to kill you. You can't stay here." "Nowhere else to go," the leader replied simply. "We die here, or we die running. But maybe you help us live." The sound of approaching horses grew louder from the east. Dalton and his men had circled around the creek and would reach her cabin within minutes. Martha looked at the 8 wounded warriors, then at the darkness where the posse rode with rope and righteous anger, and realized that the choice she'd been dreading since arriving in Copper Ridge was finally upon her. She could turn them away and probably save herself, though the posse might still blame her for their presence. Or she could follow the oath she'd sworn when she first picked up a medical bag. The promise to heal regardless of race or creed or consequence. The youngest warrior's eyes met hers across the moonlit yard, and she saw in them the same desperate hope she'd seen in Thomas's face when the fever took him, the same plea for life that every patient had brought to her door. Martha Kellaway made her choice. "Get them inside," Martha commanded, throwing open her cabin door and grabbing her medical bag. "Now, before—" The thunder of hoofbeats cut off her words as Sheriff Dalton's posse crested the ridge, their torches painting the night in angry orange light. 20 riders, maybe more, spread out in a semicircle that blocked any escape route from her cabin. "Martha Kellaway," Dalton's voice boomed across the yard. "Step away from those savages and nobody has to get hurt." The 8 Apache warriors had managed to dismount, but 3 of them could barely stand. Blood pooled in the dirt beneath their feet, and the youngest, the one whose pleading eyes had sealed her decision, collapsed against her doorframe with a rattling breath that spoke of punctured lungs. "These men need medical attention, Sheriff," Martha called back, positioning herself between the warriors and the advancing posse. Her Winchester felt impossibly heavy in her hands, but she kept it ready. "They're wounded, not fighting. They're Apache." Reverend Pike's voice rose from somewhere in the mob. "Same as the ones who burned out the Hendersons, killed little Sally McKinnon. You're harboring murderers, woman." "Different band," the silver-haired warrior whispered to Martha, his voice growing weaker. "We try to stop the raids, but young men, they not listen. We come to make peace, but soldiers shoot first at Waterhole." Martha's mind raced. An ambush at the Waterhole would explain the sustained gunfire she'd heard, the way these warriors had fled north instead of south toward Mexico. They weren't raiders. They were peace negotiators, cut down by trigger-happy volunteers or cavalry patrols who shot first and sorted bodies later. "Sheriff," she called out. "These men were ambushed while trying to make peace. They're not your raiders." "Peace?" Dalton spat, urging his horse closer. "Apache don't know the meaning of the word, and you've been helping them all along, haven't you? Passing information, telling them which homesteads to hit." The accusation hung in the night air like cordite smoke. Martha saw the faces of the posse members, twisted with anger and fear and the terrible certainty that came from finding a convenient scapegoat for all their losses. "I've never harmed a soul in this territory," Martha said, her voice carrying across the tense silence. "Every person I've treated, white or Indian, has left my care better than they arrived. That's my only crime." "Your crime," Pike snarled, "is consorting with the devil himself. 3 dead husbands wasn't enough. Now you're bringing death to all of us." Behind Martha, the youngest warrior's breathing grew more labored. She could hear others struggling to stay conscious and knew that without immediate treatment, at least 4 of them would be dead before sunrise. The Hippocratic oath echoed in her mind. First, do no harm. But how could she heal when surrounded by men who saw healing itself as treachery? "I'm going to treat their wounds," Martha announced, never taking her eyes off Dalton. "You can stand there and watch, or you can ride away and let me work. But I won't let them die on my doorstep while you debate their guilt." "You take 1 step toward that cabin," Dalton warned, "and we'll assume you're choosing sides." Martha looked at the faces surrounding her. Dalton's weathered features set in grim determination, Pike's righteous fury, the cold calculation of men who'd already decided she was guilty. Then she looked back at the wounded warriors, at the young man whose blood was soaking into her porch boards, at the older leader who'd sought her help because desperate people always recognized each other. She'd spent 3 years running from the accusations that followed her like shadows, trying to find some corner of the frontier where she could practice medicine without being blamed for the random cruelties of fate. But there was no such place, she realized now. There would always be another accusation, another death to blame on the cursed widow, another reason to make her the outsider. Unless she chose to stop running. Martha Kellaway had buried 3 husbands and countless patients. She'd delivered babies in soddy houses and amputated limbs by lamplight. She'd seen the best and worst of humanity in the stark honesty that only the frontier could provide. And in all that time, she'd never once refused to heal someone who needed healing. She wasn't about to start now. "Then I'm choosing sides," Martha said quietly, turning her back on the posse and kneeling beside the youngest warrior. Her hands found the bullet wound in his chest, applying pressure to slow the bleeding, as she'd done 100 times before. "I choose the side that values life over vengeance." The click of 20 hammers being pulled back go through the night air. But Martha didn't look up from her patient. She'd made her choice, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt truly free. Behind her, the silver-haired warrior struggled to his feet. "She is brave woman," he said in English loud enough for all to hear. "Braver than men who shoot from darkness. We remember this." Martha worked by torchlight as the standoff continued, cleaning wounds and applying bandages while the posse watched in stunned silence. Gradually, as her patient stabilized and her actions spoke louder than accusations, she noticed something changing in the faces around her. Not all of them. Pike and a few others still glared with righteous fury, but some of the younger men began lowering their weapons. When dawn finally broke over Copper Ridge, 8 Apache warriors sat propped against Martha's cabin wall, their wounds dressed and their fever breaking. The posse had dwindled to a handful of diehards, most of the riders having slipped away during the night, rather than participate in what was clearly becoming something other than frontier justice. Sheriff Dalton was the last to holster his weapon. "This doesn't end here, Martha," he said quietly. "Folks won't forget." "No," Martha agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing." As the sun climbed higher and the remaining members of the posse finally rode away, The silver-haired warrior approached Martha with something she hadn't seen in 3 years, respect instead of suspicion. "You saved us," he said simply. "Now we save you. Any who speak against Healing Woman will answer to Strong Bear's people." Martha smiled, understanding that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for since Thomas died. Not a place where she could hide from her reputation, but the courage to live up to it. They'd called her the Cursed Widow for so long that she'd almost forgotten she'd once been called something else. Doc Martha, the woman who could heal anyone, anywhere, no matter the cost. As she watched the 8 warriors ride slowly toward the mountains, their wounds bound and their lives restored, Martha Kellaway knew she'd never run from accusations again. The frontier had finally taught her the difference between being cursed and being free. The story of Martha Kellaway spread across the territory like wildfire. But the telling changed with each mouth that spoke it. Some said she'd made a pact with the Apache, trading safety for information. Others claimed she'd been bewitched by ancient medicine men. But those who'd witnessed that dawn standoff told a different tale, of a woman who'd chosen healing over hatred, courage over comfort. Within a month, Martha's cabin became known throughout the region as a place where anyone, settler or Apache, rancher or rustler, could find medical care without judgment. The raid stopped, not through violence, but through the gradual understanding that some sanctuaries were too valuable to violate. Strong Bear kept his word, and Martha found herself under the protection of both cultures. She never remarried, but she was no longer alone. The curse of the widow had been broken not by supernatural intervention, but by the simple act of choosing compassion when the world demanded vengeance. In a land where survival often meant hardening one's heart, Martha Kellaway had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength came from keeping it open. The frontier had tested her, accused her, and nearly destroyed her. But in the end, it had also set her free.